Okay, folks, we are going to start ethnicity and crime now. So, next topic, we've done gender. This is ethnicity. Obviously, we've got class and age still to do for your cage questions, which could come up. I want to start with a bit of quick maths. So you need to think about this one. The majority of the population is purple, but then there's suddenly a migration of blue people, and then when the blue people are there, they add up to 2.5% of the population. In addition to the purple majority, there is one other group of people who are orange, and they make up 13% of the population. So, in order for fair representation to take place in the prison system, what percentage of the prison population do you think should be orange? Think about it. I'm hoping that the answer that you've constructed in your head is 13%. It's not a trick question. That's what we mean when we say representation. That, in the area that you're looking, whether it's the prison system, whether it's Parliament, whether it's the number of CEOs, whether it's the number of nurses, whether it's the number of chief executives, whether it's the number of firemen, whether it's the number of whoever, okay? Whatever job it is, whatever sector it is, whatever you're investigating, if it's fair representation, it should match what is the wider population of the whole. So if 13% of the country that you are living in is orange, the representation is fair if 13% of the prison system is orange. The same way 13% of the number of MPs should be orange, 30% of the number of executives should be orange, 30% of the number of lawyers, doctors, nurses, whatever, okay? That is what fair representation looks like. And obviously, when we're talking about things like representation, ethnicity is going to be our focus. So when we're looking at ethnicity, we're going to be looking at groups who are overrepresented in the prison system. Unfortunately, what you'll find, and hopefully you've got the ethnicity handbook in front of you, is that the main group who are overrepresented in the British prison system is black people. 2.8% of the population, but 11% of the prison population. If it's Asians, they are overrepresented, but only slightly, with it 4.7 to 6%. And then on your handout, what you've got is the US population and the US prison population. So in the US, 30% of people are black and 36% of the prisoners are black. Now, when you look at that, you go, actually, well, surely it's worse in America because 36% of the prison population are black. It's worse. Well, not when you consider this. Actually, there's greater overrepresentation in the UK because 3% to 11. That should be 13. Just realised there's a problem when you're thinking that should be 13. So there's actually greater representation, overrepresentation in England than there is in America, which may be a bit surprising. When you have a look at your handout as well, what you will see is that if you are black, you are 9 times more likely than your white counterparts to be stopped and searched in the UK. So there are 6 stop and searches for every 1,000 white people compared to 54 for every 1,000 black people. You're overrepresented in the prison system, you're overrepresented in the number of stop and searches. Things aren't great. So your question here is, link back to your sociological theories. What are the reasons for the overrepresentation of ethnic groups in the prison system? On the bottom, I want you to come up with at least 6, and you must theoretically link them as well. So go back to your Marxist, your functionalist, your right realist, your subcultural theory, your interactionist, whoever. Go back to those and go, right, will any of these, because you've done all of the content now, you've done most of the content, will any of these link directly to explain why you have overrepresentation of certain ethnic groups in prison or the criminal justice system? Stop it now. Have a think, fill in the bottom, we'll talk about it in a second. Off you go. Right, so I'm hoping that you've got a few bits and bobs that you can put down here. If you want to start off, let's go back to the very first lesson that we did and look at biological factors. If we go back and we look at biological factors, you might be able to say, even though it's very old and outdated, old Lombroso with his atavistic traits Remember, one of those atavistic traits was dark skin, and we said it was incredibly, it was pseudoscience basically, horrible methodology, didn't work at all, just really a product of the kind of Lombroso's kind of racist kind of generation. I say racist generation, I don't really mean that, but he's a product of his time, isn't he? Where there would have been a lot of racial intolerance, and he's going to make the judgment that dark skin equals atavistic traits. We know biologically, he said that atavistic traits predispose you to criminality. It was all pseudoscience, some of it was true, but it was an attempt at trying to link biology to crime. Wasn't a very successful one. But I'm hoping that you could go right realist and you can come up with another. Well, if you went right realist, you could go Murray and Bernstein, and you could look at the bell curve, their famous book where they look at IQ. And they blame IQ in one of the chapters there as a potential cause for criminality, saying black people and Hispanic people, because remember Murray and Bernstein are Americans, and black and Hispanic people have got overrepresentation in the prison system, as we talked about just a second ago, are more criminal because of their lower IQ. Again, I think it's Lily's research shows that that doesn't kind of stand up, but yeah, they are evidence, because again they were saying it was down to your ethnicity, black and Hispanic, essentially your biology that's mixed up with that led you to becoming more criminal. So focusing back on ethnicity. You could also do old Murray, everybody's favourite, isn't he, of Charles Murray. You could do his idea of underclass theory as well, poor socialisation. And you're like, well, how could you link that down? Because when he's talking about poor socialisation, he means lone parent mothers, and he's blaming them for not being able to socialise the kids properly and thus leave them without a role model. Yeah, that is true, that's what he says. How does that link to ethnicity? Well, unfortunately, statistics will show that there are quite a high proportion of lone parent black single mothers. Okay, and this idea of maybe black absent fathers is something that Murray's focusing on when he says poor socialisation. Role models then go from off the street, and you could link that to ethnicity that way. Obviously, none of these folks are going to be saying that the statistics are wrong. They're not going to say ethnic minorities are unfairly treated. They are just going to say the statistics are right, but this is the reason why those statistics are correct. But if you were writing a 40 marker, you'd obviously need a balanced argument, and you could go to our neo-Marxists for that. I'm hoping you remember Paul Gilroy and his idea of black crime as a myth, or, as he says, a conscious act of resistance. Now, we know that there's a very simple evaluation point with Paul Gilroy to say, well, if something's a myth and it's not really true, how can it be a myth and also a conscious act of resistance? I don't think Gilroy quite means that when he says it's a myth, but he certainly means they're no more criminal than any other group, because the media, the police, and potentially the bourgeois people in society want to vilify black men for criminality, and that's what Gilroy means. But if you consider my points there's some AO3, there was a balanced argument there where I said, well, perhaps he's, there's a contradiction, but actually what he probably means is this: there's a balanced argument. Perhaps it's black crime a myth, or perhaps it's a conscious act of resistance against racism and oppression. And your example that you could give of black crime being a myth, something generated by the media, is Hall, Policing the Crisis, where the media distract for the crisis of capitalism. So, support for Gilroy from Hall, very, very famous study. And they would obviously be saying the reverse. They'd be going, oh, hang on a minute, it's actually very unfair. It's not that there's overrepresentation in terms of them committing more crime, it's just that the bias within the system means that they are going to be more likely to be charged, more likely to be arrested, etc., etc. Let's keep it on that angle. Let's go for our interactionist. Well, who could you use again? But he comes up everywhere, every time, doesn't he? Old Cicero and typifications. Cicerel's typifications might show the police have a bias in favour of certain groups or against certain groups. One of the typifications will be ethnic minority. You know, and ethnic minority is more likely to be from a working class background, potentially more likely to have had limited opportunities with schooling, so face poor education. All of it ties in to typifications, and be male as well. So as such, Cicerel's typifications, police bias against perhaps black and minority ethnic groups. Where am I going next? Well, we could go, a lot of you might have said poverty as a cause, and absolutely, and who can we tie poverty in for? But we could possibly go with Merton, we could possibly go with strain theory. The further you are from the goal of society, the valued goal of the American dream, the more likely you are to be under strain and thus snap and become one of the criminal adaptations, the most common criminal adaptation being the innovator. So would an ethnic minority person be more likely to be in poverty? Yes, statistics show that they will be, so maybe it is strain theory that works correctly in predicting why they commit crime. Because what you're going to have here, as you see, is you're going to have some who would agree that they are more criminal and the statistics are accurate, some that would disagree, and some that would say that there's a bias. Obviously Merton would be agreeing. And because Merton would agree, you could also go then to subcultural theory. You could have Cloward and Olin. You could do blocked opportunities, because those groups, ethnic minority groups, might have greater blocked opportunities, and you could support that with Nightingale, who very famously studies young black lads in America who are in the Bloods and the Crips. And if you recall, he says what they want is a job. So again, tying in. But if you can see what you've kind of generated on the board there, if you've come up with similar ideas to me, just through the knowledge that you've already got of these social theories, you've kind of developed a balanced argument. You've kind of got a pro and a con, support and against this idea that ethnic minority representation is fair. And I think that will be the question. When they say, what is the reason for ethnic minority? They're not going to ask you to... They need you to have an argument in this. They need you to have a debate. So the kind of question they could ask you is, evaluate the view that representation of ethnic minorities in the prison system is fair or unfair or balanced or not balanced, or that they're treated well or they're treated badly or they're treated favourably or not favourably, to give you the kind of ammunition to create a balanced argument. And that's what you'd have to do for a 40 marker on ethnicity. So that is showing really the knowledge that you've already got. And the good news about when we get to these topic questions is you've done all of the content now. There is nothing really new that I'm going to be throwing your way. All your content's fixed and done. It's just how you apply what you know. So it's getting to grips with stuff like that. Okay, turn yourselves onto page number 2. Before you do that, obviously at the top of your page, you've got some key terms that we're going to be talking about today. Intra-ethnic. It's one important thing we would say is crime is within the same ethnic group. Okay, so statistically, if you're going to be, if I'm a white dude and I'm getting robbed on the street, I'm more likely to be robbed by a white dude, and the other way around, depending on your different ethnic background. So crime is generally intra-ethnic, but obviously it's not always. It's just the majority of the time it is. Okay. We've got this idea of canteen culture, which we're going to be looking at as a potential excuse for kind of maybe discriminatory policing practices in previous years in the 90s in England. Now, Waddington is a guy who studies canteen culture, and remember, in section A of component 1, this is a kind of process of socialisation. Happens over the break table, in the dining room, where the police pass on perhaps inflammatory and negative, stereotypical kind of ideas about different ethnic groups, who they are policing and how to police them. So canteen culture, that is quite a negative one, but remember, you're not just using it here, you're also going to be using it in section A of component 1. And then of course institutional racism. So this, the McPherson report, you may or may not be familiar with, is, you will be after today's lesson, is a report into the murder of Stephen Lawrence, who was a young black lad, college age, who was killed in Eltham in London in 1993 in April, and he is murdered by a gang of white lads. And I'm going to give you some links to some documentary footage to watch of that, which is quite harrowing in just a little bit. And when you look at that, the documentary will set the scene for the time, and it will be useful revision for some youth culture as well, because we did go over a lot of the issues faced by migrants and issues of race in the 20th century. But Stephen is killed by a gang of 5 white youths, and the police afterwards, there is an official report called the Macpherson Report that finds that the Metropolitan Police is institutionally racist in the way they deal with the Stephen Lawrence murder. And that's not to say they're blaming the police for the murder of Stephen Lawrence, but they are blaming the police follow-up and the action afterwards, which led to 5 suspects go in without sentence or without charge for 25 years after his murder. Even though 2 days after the murder, their names had been handed into the police by two separate people, and given the police information about the names of these people. So Macpherson Report showed them the Metropolitan Police of London were institutionally racist, and it's very, very important. So what we're going to do now, though, is give yourselves 5 minutes to do a quick recap on the measures of crime that we've looked at before. So here on page number 2, you've got official stats, self-report studies, and victim surveys. What I want you to do is spend a couple of minutes just writing out a definition for what that means and what they mean. And then on the back, you'll see you'll have to read through this section on victim surveys, read through this section on self-report studies, and answer the 2 questions below, which will relate to how we might use those measures of crime to look at ethnicity and criminality. Right, I'm hoping that you've done that, and I'm hoping that it's not too hard to remember the difference between them. The official stats, the ones given by the police. The self-report study, have you been a naughty boy or girl in the last year? Usually these are only given to juveniles as well, as a weakness of self-report study. And then of course victim surveys, like the British Crime Survey, where people are asked, have you been the victim of a crime in the last year? Here we know that there's a problem with the official statistics. Most of this stuff that we've got on here covers whether or not the police are going to be involved, whether or not there's accuracy maybe in these official stats. What do victim surveys show? Well, you'd have thought victim surveys would be a bit more accurate. They're anonymous. They might give us a more valid and true representation of what the crime rate is. However, Bolin and Phillips' research is going to show things still are not very good if you are a black young person. Because what they show, and this is a big weakness of victim surveys, which is the answer to question 1 on page number 3, identify the problem of using victim surveys to study ethnic differences in offending, that even if you have not been the victim of a crime that was committed against you by a black person, you are likely to over-identify the black person as the perpetrator, which obviously is going to shake the reliability of these kind of measures of crime. Also, victim surveys exclude people who are under 16, so you don't ask under 16-year-olds about whether or not they've been the victim of crime, and we know that commonly the person most likely to commit a crime is also most likely to be the victim of a crime, and that is peak offending age is about 17 for young men. So people who are under 16, 15-year-olds, ethnic minority 15-year-olds, might be the victims of crime regularly, but they're never going to be answering these surveys. So again, levels of victimhood are going to go unknown. Self-report studies are probably the best measure to kind of challenge the idea that black criminality, certainly in the UK, is much higher than white criminality, because Bolin from Bolin and Phillips as well, Graham and Bolin find that what happens with whites and blacks is very similar in terms of the level of offending, 43 to 44. But yeah, obviously we know if you are black in the UK, 30% of the population is going to be in prison, whereas only 3% of the population are black. So we're talking about 4 times higher, whereas whites are not overrepresented in the same way. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the case of Stephen Lawrence. Now, if you've got the PowerPoint open, these hyperlinks take you straight to it. There's 2 YouTube clips here. The bottom left one is a Vimeo. That is the one that I would want you to watch, and I would urge you to watch the first 16 minutes of it up until the point, and it is quite harrowing, so bear this in mind, up until the point of Stephen's murder on the street. And then the follow-up, these show, this one is a very quick one, which is probably the most useful one, from the Telegraph, which shows a kind of quick timeline, 4-minute timeline of what happened from the murder to today. And then I put this one on there. You won't believe it, because for 25 years they went unpunished, these lads who killed, and only 2 of them have gone down for it. These lads who were allegedly involved in the murder of Stephen Lawrence, 2 of them who have been found guilty for it, did a kind of Martin Bashir style Tonight with Trevor McDonald interview, and you can watch that and listen to the inconsistencies in their story, and when they're challenged by Martin Bashir at the end to say, you did this crime, didn't you? Their responses are, I think, almost laughable. So a bit harrowing, but what I want you to do is watch that. That is your next activity. So pause it here and familiarise yourself with this case of Stephen Lawrence, which leads to the Macpherson report, where we see the Metropolitan Police classed as institutionally racist. They're an organisation who did not serve Stephen's family properly in the investigation, and they did that purely on the basis that he was black. And one of the key ideas that they will kind of go into, which you'll see in the video, is the police are focusing on the fact that because he's black, and they think all the crimes intra-ethnic, that Stephen was a gang member, and thus he wasn't attacked by white lads, it must have been kind of like a gang-related kind of murder. And that's why they didn't investigate it properly, or one of the reasons. Okay, so I'm hoping that you've made some notes here on the case of Stephen Lawrence in bottom of page 3, just so you've got something to familiarise yourself with, should you need to use this as an exam question. I know it was a while ago, but that's probably the most important case in the UK when it comes to policing and ethnic minorities, because it did enact a change in the system. You might be sitting there going, well, if black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched, things aren't brilliant still, and maybe they're not, but the Macpherson report did spearhead a bit of a change in British policing, especially towards black and minority ethnic people. We're going to move on now. Now, on page 4, on the top of page 5, you've got a section for statistics and explanations, and this is the kind of next activity that I want you to do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to post out a PDF which has got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 explanations or bits of statistics on there, that some of which are quite up to date. I got these statistics this year, so some has got very up to date statistics, especially on arrest and caution sentences and prisons for ethnic minorities. So I'll post those out. It won't be in the right order, so you'll have to read through it and you'll have to take the salient points and make sure you've got a table that is then complete with all of the relevant notes. You'll see once that is done that one of the points in there is by Waddington, who would say actually ethnic minorities are not necessarily targeted more by police, but because they live in areas that are more heavily targeted by police, it's just a byproduct of stop and search, that they are the ones who are stopped and searched more. Whether you buy into Waddington's idea, I'll leave that up to you, but that is where we are up to at the minute. Okay, so pause it there, make sure your table's complete, and everything up to page 5 is done. So we'll go through these. You know what, I'll click through these slowly, so just in case you've got them the wrong way round, so you can pause it when you see it on there, just in case. And as I said, the arrests and caution rates, sentencing, for example, they are up-to-date statistics. So I've got ones from 2020 and 2021 for those. Okay, the next section in your handout is going to focus on Neomarxism, which we've actually already discussed, and then something that we haven't talked about, which is left realism. Okay, left realism, and we will look at that in just a second. But I'm going to pause this video now, and I'm going to attach another video onto it later. Okay, so we're just going to finish this booklet off, and we're going to look at left realist and neo-Marxist explanations for kind of ethnic differences in offending. We've already seen in this video, and we've looked at our neo-Marxists. When we did our neo-Marxists, we looked at the work of Gilroy and his idea about black criminality, and Stuart Hall and policing the crisis. The left realists that we've got are the same left realists you've studied when you looked in general at the left realist theory, which was Lee and Young. Now remember, the Young that we're talking about here is Jock Young, old Jock Young, who's flirting with neo-Marxism, then he's left realism, and all the time he's a bit of an interactionist, confusing Jock Young. So Jock Young is going to be, Lee and Jock Young are going to be the people that we focus on here. Now, you should hopefully remember that according to them, the cause for crime is multifactorial. It's based on relative deprivation, marginalisation, and then the impact of subcultures. Now, what you'll see here, as you read through it, is that can relate directly to ethnicity, because we know that ethnic minority groups are most likely to experience relative deprivation. They're most likely to be a group with limited support and therefore pushed to the side of society. Not very many people are looking out for them, have their interests at heart. They're not members of trade unions, they're not members of groups which have got their interests and can, advocate for their interests, for lack of a better term. And then, of course, the kind of formation and joining of subcultures. And we can see that because we know there's lots of problems in terms of knife crime and gang-related violence in places like London, and a predominance within there will be ethnic minorities taking part in this kind of gang-related, kind of turf war and drug wars. And a lot of these are just young men who've been kind of groomed into that situation. So, take a read of page 6, which outlines Lee and Young. And take a look at page, we'll talk about Stuart Hall in just a second and neo-Marxists. So have a read through page 6, take in what they've said and look at how it relates to what we've already kind of covered when we looked at relative deprivation, subcultures, marginalisations. So, remember, both of these, because you remember Jock Young is a bit of a neo-Marxist as well. Both of these are going to have a kind of different slant on it. For our neo-Marxists, they won't like the statistics. For our left realists, they will. And we can see here how Gilroy and Hall would think that there's a bias against black people and ethnic minorities. But for Lee and Young, they have to take the statistics as read. And because they're realists, they're going to say, well, the police might be racist, but they're not going to be kind of overtly and over the top with their racial kind of behaviour and profiling. They do make a note that 90% of crimes known to the police are reported by the public rather than by the police themselves. So it can't be that the police are just targeting black people for those crimes. It must be that the public have reported that perhaps it was an ethnic minority person who took part in the crime against them. So they're not going to be quite on the same side as the neo-Marxists to say we've got biased police in here. They are going to accept some bias in the police, but they are going to be defending them as well. They would also look to the point that they would say black people are far overrepresented in the prison system and by the police in terms of their stop and search than Asian people. So what they would say to kind of look at that is go, well, if the police are racist, does that mean they're racist against only one group? And they would consider that that would be unlikely as well. So we've got potentially quite a few points here. Now, I'll leave it on that page. There are criticisms So have a read through the criticisms of Lee and Young, but note, as I said, they're taking a bit of a more positive angle to this. They're saying things about, but not too bad. They're not being particularly blaming of the police. However, what you will find is that all these factors are kind of like structural factors which affect black and minority ethnic people. It's not like the right realists who say, oh, poor socialisation or oh, low IQ, and it's not like the old Lombroso of like, well, dark skin, that's biologically predisposed to crime. They're kind of saying there might be some truth in the statistics, but really, if we didn't put black and minority ethnic people more heavily in deprivation or marginalise them, then perhaps we wouldn't get that same level of criminality. So they're treated, badly by society, but the criminal justice system is not necessarily skewed and biased against them. That's what they would say. Whereas when we get to our neo-Marxists, if you turn yourselves on to page 8 and page number 9, they are going to be saying something different. Now, we've got Paul Gilroy, we've talked about him earlier, we've talked about Stuart Hall as well, and you should be familiar with those studies. Outlines of them are both on page 8 and page 9. But Lee and Young will criticise Gilroy and their idea that black crime is a myth. And they will criticise them in these 3 ways, okay? So here are your prompts to consider. First thing they would say, first generation immigrants in the 1950s, 1960s were very law-abiding. So, ... What's the problem with what Gilroy's saying that Lee and Young might kind of counteract it with? Most crime is inter-ethnic. Victims usually have the same ethnic background. So, how might that be a problem with Gilroy saying all crimes are an act of resistance? And also, black crime rates are similar or lower than whites. So the police would have to be, and that was a point we were talking about earlier. So here is your finishing points. If first generation migrants in the 1950s and 60s were very law-abiding, it's unlikely they'd pass down a tradition of an anti-colonial struggle to their children. If most crime is intra-ethnic, it can't be an act of resistance against oppressors, because you'd be committing crime against white people if you were oppressed by white people. And then finally, if Gilroy were right about this, then the police are only racist towards black people and not Asians, which seems unlikely. It would seem more likely the police are generally racist to all ethnicities. So, those are your kind of Lee and Young critique points of Gilroy. Make a note of those on page 8, and then we are almost done. So, instead of getting you to do any practice paragraphs, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to leave you with this. And this is a 40-mark question, which I want you to do a plan for. Okay? And the question is this: assess the view that some ethnic groups are treated less favourably than others by the criminal justice system. So essentially you could say, this question boils down to, are we saying that black and minority ethnic people are treated worse than white people, for example, in the criminal justice system? Now, this is a 40-mark question. And as such, remember, you want to kind of go from idea to idea to idea to idea. You're going to be AO3 in as you go, but also your kind of paragraphs should build together an argument, okay, as you are going. So you should have evaluation all running through this. What I would like you to do is see if you could put together a plan for it using all of these potential points. The McPherson report, the information that we got about self-report studies, Waddington and police bias, and some of the statistics in this table and his reason as to why the police were not biased, biological theories, right realists on socialisation, Cicero's typifications, left realist idea that, of multifactorial causes of crime, Gilroy, Hall, strain theory by Merton, and subcultural theory, blocked opportunities. Put together a plan using these, and all you've got to do, and it's quite straightforward, is put them onto one side or the other. So assess the view that some ethnic groups are treated less favourably than others. Well, you know that Gilroy is going to say, yeah, they are treated less favourably. Black crime's a myth. conscious act of resistance, blah, 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 blah. And then, of course, Stuart Hall can go on this side. But you know that on the other side, you might have Lee and Young, who are going to say, although things are bad, they're not treated less favourably by the criminal justice system, but by the structure of society. And you'll have your right realists on here saying they're not treated badly at all, it's their own fault. So start to put together your plan for this. And what we've got is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You've probably got about eight paragraphs worth of content here, perhaps, that you can flesh out. So my advice is get to grips with that. Can you plan that one out? And that's where we're up to. That will complete ethnicity and crime. And note that what you've basically done today is just apply what you know to the topic.